The Guardians of the Galaxy? It's Space Squash on Virtual Boy Works Episode 15. A common refrain you may have noticed throughout these Virtual Boy Works retrospectives is my belief that Virtual Boy's haphazard release and quick demise compromised some potentially excellent games by forcing their creators to rush them to market. In fairness, interesting but clearly in need of more time is pretty much the definition of launch window software. But at a mere 8 months from its Japanese launch in July 1995 to the ultimate March 1996 arrival of 3D Tetris, Virtual Boy's entire lifespan amounted to nothing but launch window. We see that phenomenon in action again here with Space Squash, which comes to us from some old friends from the world of Game Boy Works. Developed by Tomcat System, Space Squash was released exclusively in Japan by good old Coconuts Japan, who you'll remember from favorites like Pachinko Time, Amida-kun, and that timeless classic card game. Coconuts Japan was not a barrel-bottom publisher, but they definitely catered entirely to the Japanese market, hence their name, with fairly humdrum, unexceptional titles. The company mostly stands out now in Game Boy history for the fact that their software shipped in standardized trade dress with manuals that looked like tiny duotone Game Boys. They didn't carry that sensibility forward to Virtual Boy, but neither is Space Squash a forgettable nothing of a game either. On the contrary, it stands as a Virtual Boy release that genuinely engages with the console's distinctive tech and tries to make a proper go of it. The Virtual Boy is weird in that the games you're most likely to return to, nearly 25 years later, do very little to harness the parallax visual tech that gave the system its name. The visual depth elements of Jack Brothers, V-Tetris, and Virtual Boy Wario Land amount to window dressing, while more ambitiously 3D games like Red Alarm and 3D Tetris are difficult to revisit thanks to their choppy frame rates and eye-bleeding visuals. On the other hand, Space Squash most closely resembles Virtual Boy's debut title, Mario's Tennis, except it adds an extra dimension to the action. The game takes the form of a head-to-head, albeit single-player of course, port-based sports title. Technically, despite the name, this game has as much to do with the sport of squash as it does the gourd vegetable of squash. Players face off against an AI opponent at opposite ends of the court, each guarding their own separate goal, so it only slightly resembles a racquetball-style sport during the boss face-offs. It's more like tennis meets handball played on a fully 3D court, I guess. But that's okay because it's still a pretty decent game that really plays up the system's depth rendering capabilities. On top of that, it also uses the dual D-pad controller to good effect. All told, it's one of the better conceived releases for Virtual Boy. But again, it's one of those games that doesn't feel like it spent quite enough time in the oven. Now, history has taught us not to expect perfection from Coconuts Japan, but Space Squash definitely gives off the vibe of a work that could have been a genuine classic with more refinement, but instead it came out as more of a promising rough draft. Space Squash casts players in the role of a sports-playing robot called Petron, which must work its way through a galactic, not-quite-squash tournament by defeating other sports bots. Petron looks an awful lot like Robert from Jumping Flash, a game that shipped in Japan about 3 months before Space Squash, making their resemblance to one another just one of those things. Petron hits the ball when it moves into the forecourt and can move laterally in all directions around the screen to defend its side of the court. Each match is a best-of-3 challenge against a computer-controlled robot player, which defends its own side of the screen, and a competitor gains a point anytime they manage to slip a ball past their rival and hit the wall opposite. You move with the left D-pad, while the right D-pad is used to defend. Pressing up, left, or right causes Petron to extend its arms in that direction and deflect the ball with its hands. The physics here aren't super complex, but they do allow for a bit of finesse. The direction in which Petron reaches out, combined with the robot's relative position to the ball, and even the speed at which Petron is moving, has some effect on how the ball moves. And mastery of these details becomes crucial in the boss battles, which seal up the opponent's goal and become a test of pinpoint accuracy. Thankfully, pinpoint accuracy is not required for defending Petron's own wall. Space Squash has blessedly generous collision detection. So long as you time Petron's swing and are generally in the same area of the screen as the ball, you'll hit it back at your opponent pretty easily. And because it's Space Squash! Rather than, boring tennis or something, there's a sci-fi tinged action game element at play here too. While the fastest route to victory is to slip the ball past your opponent and into their goal, you could also win by treating Space Squash as an action game. Each character has a set of unique stats, including speed, power, and endurance. These mostly work about as you would expect, but endurance is not simply stamina for long matches. It's health, denoted next to each character as a series of heart icons. If a character, including Petron, is struck by the ball without swinging at it, they'll take a point of damage and become momentarily stunned. When a character's heart icons are completely depleted, it'll explode and cede the point to its rival. Different competitors possess different degrees of stamina. The speedy Robbie X has only 2 points of health, making it fairly easy to destroy, while bulkier enemies have much greater endurance. The bosses can only be destroyed by reducing their energy to 0, since their arenas seal off the far wall and render a goal-based victory impossible. To help expedite the process of pummeling a foe into submission, Space Squash introduces both bonus items and special powers to each match. Bonus items appear within the court when special boxes, usually located in the corners of the court, are smashed by the ball. Bonuses can range from boring extra points to vital extra continues. Because they tend to be tucked into the corners and out of the way of the core action, it takes a bit of skill or luck to unlock them. On the other hand, you always have your special bonus feature. Each player has a special gauge that can be charged and spent to activate a bonus power. A power boost, a speed boost, a homing attack, or a temporary barrier that protects that character's goal for about 5 seconds. You can choose one power before each match, and your opponent also has access to the same set of potential skills. Charging the gauge is not immediately intuitive, as you need to hold it down on the right D-pad while the ball is in play, but these powers can make a huge difference in the outcome of a match. Particularly essential is the homing shot, which makes the boss battles a lot less toilsome. Bosses are hard to hit and have multiple phases, and if you lose a round against a boss, you have to start all over again. All told, it's a pretty neat idea for a game, and it plays fairly well. It also comes off as a completely unfinished creation that was rushed to market. Petron faces off against 5 distinct opponents throughout the game, plus bosses, but a complete start-to-finish run-through of Space Squash contains something like 25 matches. That is to say, you end up competing against the same rivals over and over again. Every round, it's the same thing. You challenge the same robots in sequence, followed by a boss. With each round, the individual matches grow more difficult as your opponents gain speed and skill, while the courts grow smaller and more complex. Despite the difficulty curve, it's still the same thing every time, with the same strategies and the same challenges in play. But Jeremy, you say, even punch out repeated opponents throughout the circuits. Yes, and that's true, but rematches with Glass Joe and King Hippo were interlaced with bouts against New Blood. Here, only the bosses differ from round to round. First, you battle a snake mech that can only be defeated by smacking its head with a ball. Then you battle a robot that can separate into a swarm of bats, not unlike the vampire boss in Jack Brothers. Third is a monkey, followed by, well, I'm not sure because I always run out of continues at the monkey. Okay, well there's a frustration. Space Squash offers only limited continues and no save or restore function. It's a game that has to be completed in a single sitting, and a complete playthrough takes more than an hour, which, well, it's not easy on the eyes, let's say that. Then again, aside from the unique bosses, there's not really all that much reason to play through the entire game, since it's basically just a repeating loop of the same challenges. This is where Space Squash really frustrates, because at first glance it seems like there should be lots of variety. Between rounds, you're giving a Taito-style bracket map to travel along. Complete a set of matches, beat the boss, and move along to your choice of the next set of matches on the bracket. Unfortunately, this is not as convincing a system as the ones in Darius or Puzzle Bobble. Whereas Taito took pains to give players wildly different experiences depending on the routes they traverse to the end, Space Squash does very little to distinguish between paths. No matter which way you go along the map, you're always going to face the same set of opponents in the same order, followed by the same boss. The courts seem to vary a bit, I think, but because they're all so similar, it's actually hard for me to say. This more than anything else leads me to believe that Tomcat and Coconuts Japan had grander ambitions for Space Squash than it was able to realize. With more variation between the brackets and more opponents to face, and maybe a password or battery save system to allow you to suspend play and rest your eyes, Space Squash could honestly be something special. Instead, again, it's a promising idea that doesn't quite come together as it should. There's so much potential here, but once you've cleared the first round of matches, you've basically seen the whole game. And yet, I still feel like Space Squash is a game worth experiencing. Virtual Boy releases that really went for it and properly tried to do a real 3D thing turn out to be strangely few and far between. And despite the meager contents of this overall package, what material does exist here demonstrates plenty of personality. Next episode, Jesus said to be fishers of men, but hopefully he'll settle for fishers of boy. Virtual boy, that is.